I'm the Philosophical Bachelor, and today I want to talk about Whitehead's process, philosophy, and God. In his 1929 book Process and Reality, Alfred North Whitehead presents a metaphysical theory of process which he calls a philosophy of organism. This is a philosophy suited to a universe containing organisms that can change and grow, that is, alive. Such a process metaphysics is in contrast to a substance metaphysics, where things have a fixed, unchanging essence. Substance metaphysics remains the dominant theory and is the more common way we understand reality, though process has made huge inroads, thanks to Whitehead and his contemporary Henri Bergson, who are both important process thinkers of the modern era. Up to age 50, Whitehead was better known as a mathematician than a philosopher. He co-wrote Principia Mathematica with his student Bertrand Russell at the University of Cambridge, purportedly to prove 1 plus 1 equals to 2, in 3 volumes no less. Nonetheless, he began a second act when 49 years old in London, working on physics, the philosophy of science, and the philosophy of education. He was appointed professor of philosophy at Harvard University in 1924, and in 1927 to 1928 delivered the prestigious Gifford Lecture Series at the University of St Andrews, which was published as Process and Reality the following year. Development in physics in the early 20th century brought paradigm changes to the way we understand the world. Quantum mechanics changed the way we view matter as a particle, but crucially also as a wave of energy. This is known as the wave-particle duality of matter. Relativity also posed a mass-energy equivalence. Both theories were major influences in Whitehead's thought. What if reality can be better understood, not as mass or particles, but as energy? Physics up to that time was dominated by Newtonian mechanics, which do explain motion and change, but always with the understanding of objects as matter. While it may not be explicit, all scientific theories presuppose a metaphysics. In the case of Newtonian mechanics, a substance metaphysics is presupposed. To properly conduct the enterprise of science and philosophy, Whitehead believed it was important to surface and make explicit the metaphysical basis of our scientific understanding so that it becomes capable of criticism and improvement. Perhaps energy, flow, or process is a better way of understanding nature and reality. Life, the ability to learn, grow, and change, does seem to fit a processual understanding well, but Whitehead takes it further. Everything is to be conceived as processual, not just flow concepts like evolution, but also seemingly concrete objects like cups and tables. He is a monist, not in the sense that there is only one substance the way Parmenides or Benedictus Spinoza will have it, but that everything is simply process true and true. For that reason, he rejects Cartesian dualism. There is only one type of being, and it is neither the extended or spatial being, nor the mental being of René Descartes. Metaphysics is by its nature impossible to prove, since it is meant to apply to everything, which means that proofs will have to presuppose it. However, verification is possible through the practical success of the theory, that is, from our experience, according to Whitehead. Philosophy is explanatory of abstraction and not of concreteness, he writes. There are things that are given, they are the way they are, and these brook no explanations, since what are given are simply brute facts. However, to make sense of these brute facts, we come up with schemes, theories, to consider them, to categorize them, and their relations. Whitehead's process schema comprises 4 kinds of category. 1. The category of the ultimate. 2. Categories of existence. 3. Categories of explanation. 4. Categorical obligations. While Whitehead presents these sequentially in his book, To facilitate understanding, it is better to start with the second kind of categories of what exists in Whitehead's universe. To him, what he termed actual entities, prehension, and nexus are the most concrete element in our experience. One thing that makes getting into process and reality difficult are Whitehead's terms. He aims for a precision in his writing, but that takes some getting used to. However, the new terminology does help us get away from our regular vocabulary, which is permeated by substance metaphysics. It disrupts our current understanding, which is much required if we are to adopt the new paradigm of process. Let us start with actual entities. Also known as actual occasions, they are the final real things of which the world is made up. There is nothing further behind them, nothing more real, making them the basis of Whitehead's ontology of what actually exists. To think of them as occasions is suitable, since in process philosophy, everything are really events and not concrete objects. These actual entities are composed of prehensions. A prehension is the way an event or occasion is being grasped by the subject, the relation between the subject and other actual entities. A concrescence of prehensions gives rise to an actual entity. Concrescence comes from the word concrete, in this case of prehensions coming together to form an actual entity. Note that once again, he uses a different but related word, concrescence and not concretize, to get away from the idea of the concrete in substance metaphysics. Actual entities come together to form a nexus. When we get to his third kind of categories of explanation, these concepts will be further elaborated. But let us return to his first kind of category, the category of the ultimate. According to Whitehead, creativity is the ultimate principle by which the many become the one actual occasion, where the many enter into complex unity. Creativity here is not a creatio ex nihilo, a creation from out of nothing the way the Christian God seemed to have wrought nature from out of nothing. Instead, creativity for Whitehead is where many prehensions come together to create an actual entity, and how many actual entities come together to produce a nexus or a new unified actual entity. This novel actual entity that has been created is synthesized out of the many disjunctive actual entities, forming a whole new actual entity, composed of disjointed actual entities but different from them. This conjunction of parts gives us something that is more than the mere sum of its parts. The term Whitehead has of this creation of the one from the many is concrescence, be it a concrescence of prehensions to form an actual entity, or a concrescence of actual entities to form a nexus. So far in the first two kinds of categories, Whitehead has basically been defining his terms. The meat of his metaphysics lies in the third and fourth kind of categories. Let us first examine the third, the categories of explanation. In his words, the actual world is a process, and the process is the becoming of actual entities. In the becoming of an actual entity, the potential unity of many entities in disjunctive diversity, actual and non-actual, acquires the real unity of the one actual entity, so that the actual entity is the real concrescence of many potentials. Not all entities are actual. Some are merely potential. However, by having such potential, every entity becomes involved in the concrescences of actual entities. Actual entities become what they are through concrescence. Concrescence happens in several ways. What concrescence brings together are prehensions, and there are two types of prehensions. Physical prehensions are the prehension of other actual entities, while conceptual prehensions are prehensions of eternal objects. What are eternal objects? Eternal objects are not actual. They are pure potentials, real concepts that have the potential to ingress into the process of the becoming of actual entities, contributing to the definiteness of the actual entity, like Platonic forms. Actual entities become what they are through prehending other actual entities and eternal objects. They in turn have the potential to be prehended by other actual entities, objectified to become realized as part of that new actual entity. How an actual entity becomes constitutes what that actual entity is, writes Whitehead. His principle of process states that an actual entity's being is constituted by its becoming, which is via prehensions. To analyze an actual entity is then to analyze its prehensions. Every prehension consists of three components: the prehending subject, the datum which it prehends, and the subjective form, which is how the subject prehends that datum. Note that the word datum is the singular for data, which is appropriate since what is being prehended is never the thing in itself, but information from that thing. Not everything prehended by the subject forms a part of the actual entity. Positive prehensions do form a part, while negative prehensions do not. The data from a negative prehension is inoperative in the concrescence of the actual entity, though the subject does register its subjective form, which it then rejects. An interesting corollary of this is that each actual entity prehends all entities in the entire universe, since it prehends the positive prehensions and the negative prehensions, the latter which it eliminates. Apprehension is the relation between the subject and its object, but this relation may or may not be cognitive. Beings without consciousness also prehend. Whitehead terms prehensions also as feelings, but his usage of the word feelings does not only refer to emotional feelings. Instead, we should understand feelings for him is what is not taught but felt. That said, creatures that have consciousness are able to have, in addition to non-cognitive feelings, cognitive prehensions, which he terms intellectual prehensions. A nexus comprises actual entities positively prehending one another, objectifying one another to form a union. Its actual entities maintain their uniqueness, their difference contrasting against one another. A contrast is not a contradiction or opposition, which will make union between actual entities impossible. Instead, their difference or contrast, if compatible, allows them to come together to form something novel, a new existential type. Propositions express in language what is going on or can potentially take place, usually in a subject-predicate structure. For instance, in the proposition, the apple is red. The apple is the subject and red is the predicate. Whitehead cautions us against understanding the structure of propositions to be the structure of reality. In my example, the redness is not really in the apple, but comes from our perceptive faculties, since other animals may not see the apple as red. Yet propositions can help us understand how entities come together. They express or explain concrescences among things. Why things are the way they are is due to the character of the entities being concressed or the subject concressing, which Whitehead terms the ontological principle. Actual entities are the cause. Taking a cue from Aristotle, Whitehead talks about the efficient cause, which is the being doing the causing, and the final cause, which is the aim of the entities involved. Actual entities are the only reasons, so that to search for a reason is to search for one or more actual entities, writes Whitehead. He tells us that a proposition is a lure for feeling. Logically, propositions are either true or false, but to Whitehead, that is not all. Imaginary propositions, such as statements in stories, are factually false, but yet able to generate in its subject feelings, and in that way can give rise to novelty. According to Whitehead, imaginary propositions enable progress, though they may also be erroneous. Error is the price we pay for progress, he says. A proposition can express the subjective aim of the subject, which then lures the subject towards realizing its aim in a process of self-creation. In creating, in becoming oneself, the actual entity transforms its diversity of roles from the diversity of actual entities it objectifies into one coherent role. Thus, becoming is the transformation of incoherence into coherence, he adds. When this coherence is achieved, satisfaction is attained, the process is completed and hence comes to a halt. Each element within the actual entity contributes its unique function to the final satisfaction. Concrescence takes place in phases. The individual prehensions contribute their data, which is registered by the subject as subjective forms, feelings which then integrate to form novel new prehensions. The data from negative prehensions are discarded, but their subjective forms contribute also to the formation of the actual entity, albeit negatively. Categorical obligations are the principles of Whitehead's process metaphysics, of which there are 9. 1. Subjective unity. The actual entities and eternal objects prehended by the subject generate their own individual feelings in the subject. These feelings are compatible and are integrated together to form the unity of the subject. 2. Objective identity. Each element composing the actual entity contributes its own unique functions towards the satisfaction or completion of that actual entity. 3. Objective diversity. Yet the elements retain their individual identity and function when united in the actual entity. The contrast they provide against each other is part of the form of the completed actual entity. 4. Conceptual valuation. A physical prehension gives rise to a physical feeling. However, the same feeling corresponds also to a prehension of an eternal object that is instantiated in the actual entity that is prehended. 5. Conceptual reversion. Along with the feelings from the conceptual prehension of eternal objects, the subject can imaginatively originate sense qualities to reinforce his direct experience. 6. Transmutation. Because a physical prehension and a conceptual prehension can give rise to the same feelings, the subject may substitute a prehension of a nexus containing the actual entities from his prehension of the eternal object. Wolfer-Mays explained it as how a single enduring object is substituted for the historical root of atomic events, such that we become aware of an enduring object rather than a succession of transitory events. However, we should know that the enduring object is really a stable process, a procession of events over time and not a concrete static thing. Otherwise, we will be committing the fallacy of misplaced concreteness, mistaking a process for a concrete object. 7. Subjective harmony. The contrasting elements are harmonized by the subject to form a union. 8. Subjective intensity. Because of the aim of the subject which lies in the future, feelings may be felt more intensely due to the subject's anticipation of its aim. 9. Freedom and determination. What prehensions are concressed are determined internally and hence is free. Whitehead explains, in each concrescence, whatever is determinable is determined, but there is always a remainder for the decision of the subject-superject of that concrescence, which is based on emotion, appreciation, and purpose. Mays adds, Whitehead believes that our experience of ourselves as modifying our future through our decisions is the foundation of our experience of responsibility and freedom. Whitehead explains what he means by subject-superject. An actual entity is at once the subject experiencing and the superject of its experiences. An actual entity's experience comprises both passive and active aspects. It is not just an unchanging subject passively experiencing what is acted upon it, but is also itself responding and changing in reaction to these experiences, hence actively shaping its experiences. What a subject prehends, how it prehends its object in terms of the subjective forms it develops, which prehensions are positive and which are negative, and the choice of eternal objects to ingress in its conceptual prehensions are decisions made by the superject. To recap, for most of us, the usual way we understand reality is imbued with the notions of substance metaphysics. In Process and Reality, Whitehead gives us a comprehensive set of tools comprising guiding principles and categories so that we can reformulate our view of the world and its beings through a process lens. He clearly meant for this book to be a textbook for process philosophy, not just outlining its broad principles, but demonstrating how his categories and principles can be applied to re-describe the world without relying on the notions and language of substance metaphysics. We have seen a parallel movement in the sciences and engineering, where at the advanced levels, solutions demand multivariate partial differential equations rather than those provided by discrete mathematics, better accounting for dynamic flows and processes. You may be wondering how Whitehead accounts for creativity, eternal objects, and final causes. His answer is God, though he has a complicated relationship with religion. His father is an Anglican pastor. Whitehead remained a convinced Christian while a student at university, though he later flirted with atheism and agnosticism. He found the institutional Christian concept of God too small-minded, its interpreters having scaled and whittled down the sense of infinitude to finite and limited concepts. For this reason, he thought that Paul the Apostle and his followers' idea of God is the idea of the devil. Nonetheless, he returned to a belief in God after his son Eric died in the First World War in 1918. Whitehead's metaphysics, developed in his writings in the 1920s, including Process and Reality, has an important role for the concept of God. God is a necessary element in his theory because without him, existence will make no sense. But Whitehead's God is not omniscient, transcendent, and immutable like the Judeo-Christian God of the Bible. He is not the creator of all things ex nihilo. Instead, Whitehead's God is himself processual, developmental, a work in progress, immanent in the world. For those who deny the existence of God, they may want to consider Whitehead's God as a placeholder for a term agreeable to their beliefs to describe what is needed to complete Whitehead's metaphysics, such as nature for Spinoza, cosmic consciousness for Richard Maurice Barker, the absolute for F.H. Bradley, the élan vital for Bergson, the will for Arthur Schopenhauer, or the one for Plotinus. Whitehead's God is not intended as a deus ex machina conveniently introduced to save Whitehead's metaphysics from its logical gaps. He asserts, God is not to be treated as an exception to all metaphysical principles invoked to save their collapse. He is their chief exemplification. God is an actual entity in Whitehead's theory, himself prehending and compressing. However, unique among actual entities is his dipolar, primordial, and consequent nature. God as primordial being is the unlimited conceptual realization of potentiality. His mind contains all the eternal objects which are concepts, but concepts qua concepts are not actual. To become actual, they require integration with physical feelings through prehension by actual entities. As primordial being, God is the unconditioned actuality of conceptual feelings at the base of things. But without these conceptual feelings instantiated in actual entities through prehension, the feeling is not full, and there is not even a consciousness of them, since they do not actually exist. Hence, God as primordial being has neither fullness of feeling nor consciousness. Yet, such a primordial being is already the basis for the categories as elaborated by Whitehead, itself an example of the categories. The conceptual feelings as they stand already have a relationship to one another and a unity among themselves. They supply a value in terms of their relevance to actual occasions. God is the initial object of desire, the initial impetus for creativity for actual occasions, which are actual entities, to arise. God is the originating motor of creativity, powering the unfolding of the world as the principle of concretion, the principle whereby there is initiated a definite outcome from a situation otherwise riddled with ambiguity. By definite outcome, Whitehead does not mean a determined outcome where everything is already foreseen by divine omniscience, but one that has a direction to it. Whitehead moves on to explain God's consequent nature. He is the beginning and the end, he writes, not as creator of everything, but as the actuality of conceptual operation, which is part of every creative act. Because everything is related, there is a reciprocal relationship between the world and God, mutually affecting each other. It is by the objectification into actual entities in the world that God's nature is brought to completion, into a fullness of physical feeling by being embodied in physical actual entities. These actual entities are then novel elements in God. The actual entities are given direction and aim, their final cause deriving from God's valuation of the eternal objects. Whitehead writes, God's primordial conceptual nature is unchanged by reason of its final completeness. But his derivative nature is consequent upon the creative advance of the world. As he had explained, God's primordial nature is unconscious, but his consequent nature becomes conscious through its realization of the actual world in the unity of his nature and through the transformation of his wisdom. The primordial nature is conceptual. The consequent nature is the weaving of God's physical feelings upon his primordial concepts. These physical feelings arising from the conceptual apprehension of eternal objects by the physical actual entities. The concepts in God's conceptual nature is infinite, eternal, and as a set, conceptually complete, but they are actually deficient and unconscious. To become not just conceptually complete, but actually complete, complete in actuality and conscious, they require the integration of prehension by actual entities. Both the world and God complete each other. God's subjective aim comes from the completeness of his primordial nature. Because it is complete, God's aim is also perfect. It is fulfilled through the development of his consequent nature, which is progressed towards by the unfolding creative advance of the world. Here, Whitehead takes a leaf from Bradley's notion of the absolute. At the level of the completed whole, of the absolute which includes everything, even what seems evil to us in our finite understanding achieves some good, saved by its relation to the completed whole. According to Whitehead, God has infinite patience. In the beginning was the conceptual realization of God, which leads to the multiplicity of free physical realizations in the world. Finally, an ultimate unity is achieved when this multiplicity of actual fact is unified with the primordial conceptual fact. Yet this unity is not achieved through brute force. He writes, God's role is not the combat of productive force with productive force, of destructive force with destructive force. It lies in the patient operation of the overpowering rationality of his conceptual harmonization. He does not create the world. He saves it by his vision of truth, beauty, and goodness. Unlike a wrathful God, he need not exert brute force to achieve the final unity. Instead, the logic and power of his reasoning will suffice because his vision is just too compelling for it not to prevail, though it may take some time for all the beings in the world to make that realization. A major criticism that Whitehead has for most religions are their conception of a static God condescending to the world, vis-a-vis a world in flux. According to him, the difficulty philosophy and theology faces is not merely an opposition between fluency and permanence, but the double problem, actuality with permanence, requiring fluency as its completion, and actuality with fluency, requiring permanence as its completion. Either side can only be explained in terms of the other. Whitehead's solution lies in the dipolar nature of God, primordial and consequent. The datum prehended by the world is God's primordial nature, and the datum prehended by God is the world. God's permanent and fixed primordial nature is completed in actuality through deriving his progressive, consequent nature from the fluent world. The fluent world escapes its perpetual perishing through achieving objective immortality through the immortal, permanent primordial nature of God. It does this by its reception of God's subjective aim that comes from his primordial nature and reforms itself to progress towards that aim to find satisfaction in completion. When this reciprocal completion is finally achieved, God will have been completed by the individual actual entities as a united whole, and the actual entities completed by its satisfaction of completion in their transformed selves as part of the eternal order. In line with Whitehead's process theory, what is an opposition, a contradiction, for religion is solved by realizing that fluency and permanence are in fact merely contrasting. The same move also resolves the contrast between the one and the many, conceptuality and actuality, immanence and transcendence, and creation versus development. Creation did not happen in one fell swoop, but takes place over a long development, culminating in disjointed multiplicity, concressing into a harmonious unity of contrasting elements. Whitehead adds, both God and the world are in the grip of the ultimate metaphysical ground, the creative advance into novelty. Either of them, God and the world, is an instrument of novelty for the other. 2 points to note. 1. Whitehead's process theory works at the micro as well as the macro level. Its categorical principles work at the level of actual entities, but also at the levels of nexus societies, the world at large, and even God. Each larger entity is able to be analyzed the same way as its most micro level of an actual entity. 2. Once the dogma of divine omniscience and supreme power is given up, many philosophical difficulties are resolved. If all is known due to divine foresight, freedom of will becomes questionable. If God is all-powerful in addition to omniscient, then the existence of evil is irreconcilable with what should have been a perfect world. However, in Whitehead's process theology, the answers are not all known in advance, even by God. God has a subjective aim, but he does not know the details of how it is going to play out. The details can only be known through a process of development. The broad subjective aims and categorical principles are present at the start in God's primordial nature, but the world has to unfold for them to be ultimately actualized. Whitehead's God is deistic, one which sets the initial conditions and gives the initial nudge to get the ball rolling, but does not interfere beyond that. Like the world, God too is processual, developing progressively towards its perfected consequent nature through the effort of the multiplicity of the actual entities of the world, which will finally resolve their contrast at a holistic level to become united while retaining their diversity. God becomes actual, developing from mere conceptuality, inheriting through a root of occasions, the same way the future inherits from the past and the world, to transmute its primordial permanence and the world's temporal flux into a living, ever-present fact. Because the answers are not all known in advance, some degree of freedom must be allowed to at least some of the actual entities so that novelty can emerge out of what will otherwise be strict necessity or pure randomness. As the actual entities advance, some gain consciousness. Such consciousness is self-interested, but realizations of higher aims lend a sense of worth beyond itself. To serve these higher aims may require sacrifice or personal abnegation, giving rise to the immediacy of sorrow and pain, but these are then transformed into an element of triumph, a redemption through suffering. The story does not end there. The consequent nature of God itself passes back into the temporal world according to its gradation of relevance to the various concrescent occasions. In summary, there are 4 creative phases in which the universe accomplishes its actuality. Whitehead writes, first, the phase of conceptual origination, deficient in actuality but infinite in its adjustment of valuation. Secondly, the temporal phase of physical origination with its multiplicity of actualities. In this phase, full actuality is attained by the actual entities, but there is deficiency in the solidarity of individuals with each other. This phase derives its determinate, not determined, conditions from the first phase. Thirdly, there is the phase of perfected actuality, in which the many are one everlastingly, without the qualification of any loss either of individual identity or of completeness of unity. In everlastingness, immediacy is reconciled with objective immortality. In the fourth phase, the creative action completes itself. For the perfected actuality passes back into the temporal world and qualifies this world so that each temporal actuality includes it as an immediate fact of relevant experience. For the kingdom of heaven is with us today. The action of the fourth phase is the love of God for the world. It is the particular providence for particular actual occasions. What is done in the world is transformed into a reality in heaven, and the reality in heaven passes back into the world. By reason of this reciprocal relation, the love in the world passes into the love in heaven and floods back again into the world. Whitehead surmises, in this sense, God is the great companion, the fellow sufferer who understands. In his process theology, Whitehead reveals an optimism that through the adventures and misadventures of life, we will ultimately get there. Thank you for listening to the Philosophical Bachelor.